recording. There we are. So this lesson, guys, we're going to be doing Noahide history. And I hope everybody had a chance to review the preface and lesson 1 that we talked about last week. This one, we're going to look at a little bit of the historical context behind the Noahide laws. We're going to explain really where we are today, and the concept, I think, of really how the past 1,500 years feeds into what we're doing now. And like I said, apologize for being a little hoarse and a slight cold. Okay, so let's go to the first page. Okay. Now, when we go through the Torah, when we look at the Torah, and we're going to talk about the exact derivation of the Noahide laws themselves, we're going to see the exact derivation of them in great, great detail in about 5 lessons or so. We're going to cover it in very painstaking detail. But just a general skimming through the Torah, we see that there's a concept of divine law within the Torah. After all, we see that God said to Adam and Chava, be fruitful and multiply. We see a commandment not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We also see as well these commandments about eating a limb from a living animal. So there's many, many places where the Torah enumerates to us expressions of HaShem, meaning God, of God's will. Okay? And these are all throughout the Torah. Additionally, we see there are many examples where God may not tell us his will explicitly, but we see it expressed. For example, by the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, they were destroyed for their wickedness. Sexual misconduct is the one that the Midrash, which we're going to talk about with this text is later also, that's the one that's really singled out by the Midrashim, is the prohibition of the issues of sexual misconduct. So we see that Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed for it. The generation of the flood, among their many issues, was widespread robbery. And Cain was punished for killing Abel. So we see that since there were punishments, there must have been transgressions or laws that were being transgressed. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the punishments. So it's clear from the very outset that there is a concept of divine law and of divine expectation within the Torah. Now, and again, we're going to, second. I just had one person just sent me a question about the preface in lesson 1. Both lesson 1 and the preface were very much covered in one go last week. That's why I mentioned last week I'd asked everyone to look through both the preface and lesson 1 in preparation for this week, just to answer the question that I was just asked. Okay. So it's clear that there was this concept of law. Now, what's interesting is if you look at the Torah's narrative and at the description of God's relationship to mankind from creation, we started off with Adam and Chava, with Adam and Eve. God gave them certain commandments, which they fell short of one large one in particular, which was the eating from the tree. They had other commandments as well, for be fruitful and multiply, other things like this. And they left the garden, they were exiled from the garden, and within a few generations, man had forgotten entirely about these divine expectations that God had given him. They'd forgotten about the Creator. And that brought us to the flood, where God basically rebooted creation and restarted everything with the family of Noah. And Noah, who has the eponymous Noahide laws, became the conduit through which these were passed on to the world. Now, within a few generations after Noah, the world had forgotten about this again, and then we hit the Tower of Babel and the dispersion of that generation. And with a few generations later, we get to Abraham, and the world is full of idolatry. So this whole relationship of man with the Noahide laws is one of remembering and forgetting, until you get to Sinai, where the Torah is revealed to the Jewish people. And you basically, with the selection of the Jewish people by God, you had people that were given the Torah and the Noahide laws and were told that this is all, this is my spiritual knowledge, this is my will. Instead of trying to have the whole world hold on to it, we're going to give it to a small group of people to hold on to. And it worked because it's ensured continuity of these teachings. However, starting in around the 4th century or so, the awareness of the Noahide laws dropped off tremendously. And that's what we're going to start off with over here. What do we know about the Noahide laws prior to about the 4th century? So it is clear that in ancient times there were communities that had a concept of the Noahide laws and that were non-Jewish, that they were worshippers of the Jewish God or the God of the Torah. As we get deeper into the course and we see how that these are more universal concepts, we're going to cease to use terms like Jew and Noahide and focus on the universal aspects of the Torah. But for now, let's call it the Jewish God, for now. These non-Jewish worshippers are referred to in Josephus and many of the ancient historians as the Menoi, also the Seven Menoi. They have other terms used for them as well. And the term literally in Greek means heaven fears. Now, because of their connection with the Jewish community and the fact that they are not Jewish, and also some other evidence we're going to see, it's assumed that these groups had some identity under the Noahide laws. Okay? In fact, we find that a lot of the Roman satirists, Josephus Flavius, for example, and Gaius Petronius Arbiter, not Flavius, excuse me, Arbiter, and also Decimus Iunius Juvenalis, they mocked the Romans that were worshippers of the Jewish God, but that did not keep all the Jewish mitzvah, that they didn't observe circumcision, for example, and other Jewish rituals. They mocked them. So it's clear that you had non-Jews that were intimately connected with the Jewish God, but who did not keep the mitzvot, who did not keep the Jewish mitzvot. Okay? And that's a very important point because this is going to come back later. But the description of these ancient Noahides is that they had a connection with the Jewish God, but they did not keep the Torah in the same way that the Jews do. So this would lead us to assume that these groups, the Felbomenoi, and these other groups were apparently something akin to what we conceive of as Noahides. The strongest evidence to this was actually uncovered in 1976 in Aphrodisias in Turkey. And I actually have it reproduced here on the screen if you'd like to take a look. There was a stela, a stone pillar, that was discovered outside of an ancient synagogue in Aphrodisias, and it dates from around the year 210 of the Common Era. And the first inscription at the top is a list of all the synagogue founders with all Jewish names common to the period. The second inscription is a little bit different. The second inscription is strange because it has names like Zeno, Athenagoras, Diogenes. These were all common non-Jewish Greek names. And the list of all these non-Jewish Greek names is prefaced with the inscription, and these are those who are the God-fearers. A similar inscription was discovered in the ancient synagogue of Sardis, Turkey, which dates from around the 4th century. Now, these inscriptions list three groups: Jews, converts, and then these God-fearers, these heaven-fearers that we mentioned in Greek are referred to as the Philobonoi. Now, I want to be very clear here. In our Pirchei Shoshanim course materials that we've developed, and of which I wrote the bulk of myself, but we do have an editorial committee that goes through them. We referred to the stela from Sardis and from Aphrodisias as evidence of a Noahide community. I'm hesitant to really label it evidence of a Noahide community. The reason why is that, for the purposes of being completely intellectually honest, it's not clear that these groups of heaven-fears match what we conceive of as Noahides today. I don't even know if they would have identified as Noahides. We don't know anything about them really beyond the reference, the scant references in Josephus, who was an ancient historian, the references of the satirists, and a few synagogue inscriptions that refer to these groups. And it constantly uses the term God-fears. Was this a term that this group applied to themselves? They referred to themselves as the God-fears? Or was this term one that the Jewish community gave them and referred to them as God-fears? It's not clear. There's a lot that's very, very unclear. But it is still significant that we have a non-Jewish community identifying with and worshiping the God of Israel, even participating in the building of synagogues. So whatever they were, however they identified themselves, it's the closest evidence that the ancient Jewish communities had a place for non-Jews who were not Jewish and who did not keep the mitzvot of the Torah, the divine commandments of the Torah, still had a place to identify with the God of Israel as the creator of the world. So we see that there was some concept of this that existed in ancient times, even though it might not be absolutely what we describe as the Noahide laws today. Now, can we assume that they were Noahides? Well, we see that in ancient times, that the Talmud discusses the Noahide laws. We see that as a concept they've been around for a long time. The Jewish community certainly would have related to these ancient groups as Noahides. The Jewish community certainly would have. Would they have called themselves? We're not totally sure. But as a conceptual, as a proof of concept, it's very, very significant. Now, due to the rise of power in the church, which really took off after the Council of Nicaea, and the gradual suppression of Jewish teachings, and also the almost militant campaign of conversion and proselytization that spread throughout the Roman world, with the destruction of the temple and the loss of centralized Torah authority, there really wasn't a community, a continuous community that had the Noahide laws. So whatever community existed in this group known as the Heaven-fears, or whatever else may have existed prior to the advent of the church, was lost. We have no idea what that was. It vanished from the face of the earth. There were very few rare occasions when you might have a non-Jew who approached rabbis and who the Noahide laws were brought up to him. But for the most part, you don't really see the Noahide laws really being written about or really being discussed as an independent concept. They really did not show up until the 19th century. So for all intents and purposes, there was about a 1,500-year gap from when the ancient community of Heaven-fears, or Noahides, or exactly what they were, we'll call them non-Jews who clung to the Torah. There's about a 1,500-year gap from when that community effectively disappeared, and when all of a sudden you see Noahism reappearing as an identity for non-Jews. During that 1,500-year period, the Jewish world was basically cut off from the non-Jewish world. We were not allowed to teach Torah publicly. In a lot of places, it was illegal to convert to Judaism. So there was really no connection or discussion about the concept of the Noahide laws. In the Jewish world, the Noahide laws really were not viewed as an independent religious identity. And this is an important fact here that we all need to make note of. So make note of this. They were not viewed within the Jewish world as an actual religious identity. Today, when we talk about the Noahide laws, we say that really the Torah provides for two religious identities, Jew and Noahide. You would never have heard this prior to about the 1800s. The reason why is with the absence of an actual self-identifying non-Jewish community who identified with the Noahide laws, the concept of Noahide for the Jewish world was really one of classification within the laws of the Torah. There's a difference from the Jewish perspective as to how to relate to a Noahide versus how to relate to an idolater. So for the Jewish world, we need to identify, are we dealing with an idolater, or are we dealing with someone who is a Noahide? That has nothing to do with what the non-Jew would call himself. Does everyone follow that point? Okay. That the criteria of what makes someone a Noahide, the criteria of the Noahide laws during that 1500-year intervening period, for the Jewish world was a way of classifying and dealing with non-Jewish Jewish interaction under Torah law. But there were situations when a Jew might have to know, am I doing a business deal with a Noahide or with an idolater? Now, the Noahide might not call himself a Noahide. He may not have ever heard of the Noahide laws. But we have to evaluate what he believes, where his connection with idolatry is, what his view of the Old Testament or the Torah is. These things would have to be taken into account from the Jewish perspective. So during that 1500-year period, the use of the Noahide laws from the Jewish side was really a legal criteria for interacting with non-Jews. It was not an actual positive religious identity. And it had kind of become a museum relic in that sense. The idea of Noahism and the Noahide laws as a positive religious identity was really, it was a fossil, is how it was viewed in the Jewish world, because it didn't exist. That was until a very curious thing came about in the very late 1800s. And here is where we get to kind of the first time that Noahism, that the bones of Noahism, or of the 7 Mitzvos as a positive religious identity, begin to wake up. In France at this time, in Lyon, there was a young man who had studied for the priesthood. His name was Aimé Pallière. And I actually have a photograph of him right here when he was middle-aged. This is Aimé Pallière, right here. Okay. Now, Pallière was a very, very interesting character. He was having a lot of crises of faith within Catholicism. He had come from a very devout French Catholic family. And he began this personal quest for religious truth. His personal life and family life, for a lot of reasons, made conversion to Judaism not an option for him. But he became very interested in authentic Torah study. He met several of the rabbis in Lyon. He developed an interest in the study of the Old Testament from the Jewish world, because we had this ancient tradition of exegesis, of interpretation of the Torah going all the way back to Sinai. And he wanted to have a connection to it. But conversion was not an option for him. He had an extremely difficult family situation. And his books and his biography are out there, they're wonderful reading. And so he didn't really know what to do. He couldn't convert, but he couldn't really remain a Catholic. So his friends in the Jewish community suggested that he contact Rabbi Eliyahu Benamozegh, who was the rabbi of the Sephardic community of Leghorn in Livorno, Italy. This picture up here is of Rabbi Eliyahu Benamozegh. That's the fellow right there. Both very dapper-looking gentlemen. Rabbi Benamozegh, we should mention at this point, he was the rabbi of Leghorn, but he was a bit of an unusual figure. He also taught at the University of Bologna. He was a philosopher, and he was very involved in the Universalist movement, which was this idea of trying to find a universal natural theology that all religions, that you can make an argument that all religions stem from. So this was a movement in Europe and in France and in Italy at this time. It was a fashionable European philosophical movement in the religious world. And Rabbi Benamozegh was very much involved in it. Now, in there, he traveled to Livorno or Leghorn, and he met with Rabbi Benamozegh, and they spent a day together. And after that, he left, and they never met in person ever again. But they continued corresponding for several years until Rabbi Benamozegh's death in the year 1900. The critical turning point in Pallière's correspondence with Benamozegh is this passage right here. Take a look. Rabbi Benamozegh wrote to him, "We Jews have in our keeping the religion destined for the entire human race, which the Gentiles are subject and by which they are to be saved, as were our patriarchs before the giving of the Torah, of the law. Could you suppose that the true religion which God destines for all humanity is only the property of a special people? Not at all. In other words, the Torah and the expectations of the Torah, the connection of God offered by the Torah, is not only for the Jewish people, it's for the whole world. God's plan is much greater than that. The religion of humanity is nothing other than Noahism." Boom, right there, guys. That casting of Noahism as a positive religious identity, this is really the first time in 1,500 years that it's been raised up this way. It certainly may have existed like this in the past, but again, it had very much fallen by the wayside. And in this sentence, Rabbi Benamozegh offered this gentleman from Lyon a way of connecting to God without having to convert to Judaism. Not because it was founded by Noah, but because it was through the person of that righteous man that God's covenant with humanity was made. Meaning it was through Noah that the covenant was established. And we're going to see this in later lessons. This is the path that lies before your efforts and indeed before mine. It is my duty to spread the knowledge of it also. So right there is perhaps for the Noahide movement in the past 100 years or so, the most important letter, the most important sentences written for Noahism. Now, their exchanges form the core of Pallière's book that he wrote many years later called Le Sanctuaire Inconnu, which is the Unknown Sanctuary, which is an extension and development of many of Benamozegh's ideas in his book Israel et Humanité, Israel and Humanity. Now, following their encounter, and Pallière became very involved in the Jewish community. I think he was briefly, I may be wrong, but I believe he was briefly president of the Jewish community in Lyon, even though he was not a Jew. His thought went on, their correspondence and their books went on to inspire a lot of people in Europe, and there were these little Noahide societies that cropped up in France and in Italy. Unfortunately, though, when World War I and World War II came through, it basically wiped them off the face of the map. It put an end to whatever this movement was that they were starting. But that was the beginning of this positive resurrection of Noahism as a religious identity from within the Jewish world. Now, many of you, and let me ask, have any of you ever read the writings of Pallière and Benamozegh? If you have, just post over in the board. Let's see a quick tally. Put yes or no if you've ever read any of their writings. No, no. Okay. They're very inspirational. I mean, they're very, very inspirational. And for a lot of people, consider them fundamental readings for the Noahide laws. I need to there's a little bit of there's some honest criticism that's needed here, though. While this is important historically for the history of the Noahide movement, the vision of the Noahide laws and of what it meant to be a Noahide that was kind of developing between Rabbi Benamozegh and Aimé Pallière doesn't bear a lot of resemblance to how Noahism is described in the Talmud or the traditional Jewish texts. Okay? As I mentioned before, Rabbi Benamozegh and Aimé Pallière were kind of part of this universalist religious movement that was very religious philosophy, that was very popular in Europe at this time. Okay? If you look at the writings of Benamozegh and of Pallière, it's very clear that they saw Noahism, the Noahide laws, as the embodiment of this universal theology. They saw it as a bridge between Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and even pagan beliefs to kind of bring it into this unified theology under the Torah. This presents a lot of problems, though, a lot of problems. And Rabbi Benamozegh was not without his detractors. And I'll mention to you that his philosophy and his theology on a lot of these things is very unusual, and it's sort of on the far fringe of traditional Jewish thought and of traditional Torah interpretation. Because again, they weren't really teaching the Noahide laws for the sake of Noahism, of what the Torah expects for Noahides. It was part of a larger philosophical goal. It was part of a larger universalist religious goal. And as a result, they came to some weird conclusions. Like Aimé Pallière, for example, after Benamozegh died, he continued teaching the Noahide laws. He was deeply involved with the Jewish community, but he also went to Mass every day and still took communion. So to us, in the context of the Talmudic presentation of the Noahide laws and the way that they're viewed by most of the world of Torah scholars, that's a massive contradiction. How can you be a practicing Noahide and a practicing Catholic at the same time? From our viewpoint, it's a problem. But from the position of Rabbi Benamozegh and Aimé Pallière, who they were looking for this universalist bridge between Christianity, Islam, Judaism, within the context of their thought, it's actually not that big of a problem. All in all, though, Aimé Pallière and Benamozegh, their writings are important historically, and they're inspirational, but their vision of Noahism is very difficult. It presents a lot of issues. And for this reason, it doesn't really exist today. You don't find a lot of people following their in their specific footsteps because, as I said, there's some bizarre theological places that their view goes. If you look at the bottom in the footnotes, I have a little bit of information on it at the bottom of page 12, if you'd like to take a look. Okay. Now, in the early 20th century, all right, very independent of what Aimé Pallière was doing and Rabbi Benamozegh, you had a couple of extremely important Torah scholars that were writing about the Noahide laws. Now, they weren't writing about them for the purpose of the Noahide community. They were writing for the purpose of the Jewish community, which at that point was in a period of extreme flux. You had a tremendous number of people coming to America, leaving the shtetl of Eastern Europe and coming to the United States, where they have to interact with non-Jews on a much greater level. And you also have a lot of material being published by a lot of these famous yeshivas. There was this sort of publishing boom around this time also in the Jewish world. And you had a lot of these large studies of areas of Jewish law, some of which covered Noahide law. And these studies weren't always practical. They're sometimes mostly theoretical. But the two most important that came out in the early 20th century was the Kuntras Ner Mitzvah from Rabbi Meir Dan Plotsky. And if you guys click on their names in your PDF original, it will take you to a biography of them on Wikipedia. I would strongly, strongly suggest, as you do these shiurim, as you do these classes, click on the links. Please go. Please read the biography. It's important that we all become friends, literally friends, with these Gedolim, with these great Torah scholars that we're quoting. We should get to know them and recognize their names. So I'd strongly suggest going and reading about it. Rabbi Yonason Steif, who was the head of a very big rabbinic seminary, a yeshiva in Eastern Europe, also has a very important discussion of the Noahide laws in his book, The Mitzvos HaShem. Now, these two, for any rabbi today who wants to study the Noahide laws, or anyone who wants to get into them, these two are fundamental works for the modern Noahide movement. These are exceptionally important. Unfortunately, they have not been translated into English. One thing that we're doing on our end at Noahide Nations, and also with Pirkei Shoshanim, is putting together a source book of all these classic works on the Noahide laws. We are translating it and annotating it, and that's going to be provided to everyone who takes this course. And again, it's so that you guys can go to the original source material for the sake of study and learning. So we don't have this ready yet, but we do plan in the near future to have these materials translated and available for you guys. Okay? Now, getting into the mid-20th centuries, in the 1950s and 60s, you had some interesting things going on. Post-Holocaust, the state of Israel was in a process of really setting itself up. And the main onus of Torah scholarship, where you had the main Torah scholarship happening, was in New York and in New Jersey. That's where all the main Holocaust survivors went, the most important of whom, and probably the most important rabbi in American history, was this fellow right here, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. Now, he was not just one of the most important rabbis in American Jewish history, he's one of the most important scholars of the Torah in the entire history of the world. He was brilliant, he was important. In the history of the Jewish world in particular, you probably never had a rabbinic authority, an authority on Torah law, on Torah thought, that was as widely and universally revered and accepted as Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. His importance to Judaism after the Holocaust, particularly in America, I would say is comparable to what it's comparable to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison and George Washington's importance were to America right after the Revolutionary War. If that can in any way explain to you how incredibly important Rabbi Moshe Feinstein was. Here in America, you had all these refugees from Europe, many of whom grew up in small Jewish cities in Europe, speaking only Yiddish, were suddenly thrown into these very diverse communities. And they never really encountered, to be frank, they were all ghettoized or shtetlized. They never really encountered non-Jews before. They didn't really know what to do. So there were a lot of questions about Jewish law and Noahide law, the law for non-Jews as well, that begin coming up. And Rabbi Feinstein, in the 1950s and 60s, wrote about 9 or 10 very important responsa. A responsa is an opinion in Torah law regarding Noahide laws, their interpretation and their application. And again, this is also absolutely foundational to understanding the Noahide laws today, is the writings of Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And these are accepted as fact and practice within the Torah world. And again, I would do some reading on Rabbi Feinstein. He had a fascinating life. Now, where things got really fascinating is around the time Rabbi Feinstein in New York was writing his responsa on these 10 letters, very important letters on the Noahide laws. And rabbis here in the United States were looking at them, and it was really laying the foundation for the eventual, it was laying the rails that the Torah scholarship would have to run on for the resuscitation of the Noahide movement. You had this very, very interesting figure that kind of, in the southern United States, that wandered onto the scene. His name is Vendyl Jones. Now let's do a quick yes or no over here on the side screen. How many of you have heard of Vendyl or knew Vendyl? Let's see a quick show of hands, guys, from everybody. Donald Jane says yes. Ken says yes. Zella says yes. Lonnie says yes. Okay. I also had the pleasure of meeting Vendyl on a couple of occasions. Vendyl Jones, of whatever the rabbis were doing at this time, whatever had happened before, whatever would happen after, there would not have been, I firmly believe this, it's arguable, but I firmly believe this, there would not have been this Noahide movement that we have today would not have happened, I think, if Vendyl Jones had not existed. And if Vendyl didn't exist, we would have had to invent him. For those of you who don't know who he is probably the linchpin of the modern Noahide movement. In much the same way, Martin Luther King here in the United States was not the inventor of the civil rights movement. He was not the progenitor of it, but he was the linchpin that it came to coalesce around. In many ways, Vendyl was the central figure in the Noahide movement. Somewhat unwittingly, he was. And it's very hard to discuss Vendyl. It's very hard to talk about him because if you knew him, then you loved him, you respected him, you hated him, you were frustrated with him, you admired him, you loved being around him, you couldn't stand being around him. He was a larger than life personality. And the stories about Vendyl, no matter how unbelievable they are all true. I can say that, I know that for a fact myself, and many of those of you who know him can tell you that Vendyl it's almost unbelievable. Vendyl is almost a legendary figure. You could not make up Vendyl Jones. But if he hadn't lived, we would have had to invent him. He is so central to the Noahide movement. Vendyl began his career as the pastor of a Baptist church. And in 1956, he had a very deep crisis of faith, and he lost interest and belief in the New Testament completely. So he decided to reboot his entire belief in God. And he moved to South Carolina, which many people don't realize, but the southern United States, prior to World War I, the southern United States was the center of the Jewish world. New Orleans, Charleston, South Carolina, Galveston, Texas, St. Louis, those are really the centers of the observant Jewish world in America. It was after they opened Ellis Island that everything kind of migrated up north. But at that time, Charleston, South Carolina was known as the Jerusalem of America. That was the big Jewish community. So Vendyl and his family moved there, and he enrolled in classes at a Jewish elementary school, learning to read Hebrew, learning the basics of Torah study. And he began learning with local rabbis about the Noahide laws. Very steadily, Vendyl developed this sophisticated religious identity as a Noahide that was very firmly grounded in traditional Jewish thought and scholarship. Now, later in the 1960s, in the late 60s, he got interested in biblical archaeology, and he went to Israel and finished his degrees in archaeology through Hebrew University. In his career, his main interest in his career, my impression from my conversations with him is that his main interest was really in biblical archaeology. The Noahide, for him, his Noahide identity, his Noahide beliefs were part and parcel of who he was, but he wasn't, I never got the impression that he wanted to be the father of a movement, or the central figure of a movement. But, God has certain plans for all of us, and Vendyl became known as, in the Jewish world, as the Noahide. I remember once I met him in Israel, I went to visit a very major rabbinic figure in Israel, and Vendyl came in the room, and everyone stood for him, and I had no idea who he was at that time. And they simply referred to him as the Noahide. That was how he was known, because no one had ever seen an actual Noahide. It hadn't existed in 1,500 years. Such a thing had never existed. And then there was Vendyl. And he became the rallying point, and somewhat unintentionally became the father of the modern Noahide movement. For those of you who don't know who he is, if you would not be aware of the Noahide laws, no one today would be talking about this if it were not for Vendyl Jones. It is very worth going online, looking up and reading as much as you can about Vendyl Jones. None of us would be here right now if Vendyl had not kind of come on the scene. And that's a picture of Vendyl right there toward the end of his life. Vendyl was a tremendous scholar. He was a true Southern gentleman, larger-than-life figure. And he was I guess I would say really, he was the first Noahide to really have an identity that was solidly grounded in the same Torah that we in the Jewish world were working from. So through his lectures and his writings and his articles and his Torah study classes, he really became the father of the modern Noahide movement. Now, and he passed away in 2010, and for those of us who knew him, it's still very bizarre. I know it is for me, and I didn't know him all that well, but I did know him. It feels weird not having Vendyl in the world right now, because it almost seems like the world needs certain people, and I believe the world really does need Vendyl Jones. In the 1980s, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Schneersohn, the last leader of the rabbinic court of Lubavitcher, one of the Hasidic movements, called upon the larger rabbinic community to engage in outreach to non-Jews to teach the Noahide laws. And he did this by publishing an article in the rabbinic journal Hapardes, which, though it made a deep impression within his own movement, within his own court, it was largely ignored by the rest of the Jewish world. And the reason why is that he made this push that there was a mitzvah, or an obligation on Jews to go out and teach the Noahide laws, which was the claim was a bit of a stretch, and it was generally did not catch the attention of most of the rabbinic world. So as a result, this really didn't catch on in the larger rabbinic community. You have to remember that 1984 is only 39 years after the Holocaust. The Jewish world here in America was putting every resource into rebuilding our own community and to regrowing. So calling for us to go out and do outreach to teach the Noahide laws was a burden, and it was also something that, like I said, his claim that it was a positive religious obligation really never caught on in the Jewish world. It wasn't a well-supported claim. So, nevertheless, you did have people in the Lubavitcher movement that were going out and that were teaching the Noahide laws. Now, as there was interest in Noahide laws growing and rallying around Vendyl, the mainstream of the Jewish world was sort of passed by. The fringe of the Jewish world took a deep interest in Noahide laws, and we're going to talk about this in future lessons. You need to understand that within the Jewish world, there's a lot of movements and organizations that are involved in religious disputes clothed as politics, and there are also a lot that are involved in political disputes clothed as religion. Some of these are on the far fringe of the Jewish world. In particular, you have a lot of organizations that believe that the reestablishment of the state is the beginning of the Messianic era, that we're in the Messianic era, which is a very far fringe belief within the Jewish world. For a lot of these fringe groups, the Noahide laws were an attractive way of gaining support because they didn't have much within the Jewish world. So the Noahide movement, to a large degree, was co-opted by a lot of fringe groups and groups that were outside of mainstream Judaism. This kind of pushed the Noahide movement further away from the mainstream of the Jewish world. Now, by the late 1990s and early 2000s, there were a lot of things going on in both the Jewish and the Noahide world. Among non-Jews, you had this tremendous wave of disillusionment with Christianity. And we've all seen this. There's a lot of very angry ex-Christians who feel that they were not taught honestly, and they were not given an honest a fair deal. Okay? And in particular, in the middle part of the United States, you're seeing this more and more. In the Jewish mainstream, even though that the Jewish world still in the late 1990s and early 2000s is very involved in outreach to rebuild the Jewish community, this disillusionment from the non-Jewish world has kind of pushed Noahism onto the radar. You have a lot of people today that are starting to take notice of it. Now, as it's become more on the radar of the mainstream of the Jewish world, the Jewish mainstream has also become aware of this Noahide movement that has been, in many ways, co-opted by a lot of fringe groups. Now, I'm not saying, and to be very, very clear, because I know I very well may get hate mail on this, I did in the last class, I'm not saying that everyone teaching Noahide laws is wrong. I'm saying that there are a lot of groups that are involved in the teaching of them, which are not, they're involved in a vision and a teaching of the Noahide laws that is part of a larger ideology that's problematic. Some groups are, not all, some. I'm not mentioning this to knock anyone. I'm not mentioning this to attack anyone. I'm mentioning it because I'm trying to give an honest overview of the history of the Noahide movement, and it's not possible to do that without mentioning that there are some groups that are problematic. And I'm not interested in pointing fingers and saying who it is because I don't think it's productive, but it's something to be aware of. Now, even though a lot of the Jewish groups became aware that you had these fringe groups that had kind of were deeply involved in Noahide outreach, because you had this 20 or 30-year absence of legitimate interest in the Noahide world, these groups really have succeeded in selling themselves to Noahides as valid authorities on Torah, Judaism, and Noahism. Starting in the early 2000s, a lot of these fringe groups came under heavy, heavy fire from the Jewish mainstream. And there's been this increasingly desperate and eccentric campaign between many institutions within the mainstream of the Jewish world and these fringe groups. And the fringe groups have kind of been resorting to these more eccentric and bizarre tactics to hold on to their congregations among Noahides, for lack of a better term. Because of these problems that you had, like I said, you had this, you have these fringe groups that were very clearly not thoroughly equipped to teach the Noahide laws or teaching a very skewed vision of it. And you had the mainstream of the Jewish world that was just becoming interested in it, and you had this flood of non-Jews that were also developing an interest. It became clear that something was missing, that there was a hole somewhere in the development of the Noahide laws. And what the hole was is that no one had really done a real study of what the Torah actually says about the Noahide laws. No one had actually done that. There was a lot of talk about philosophy of the Noahide laws. There was a lot of conjecture about what the Torah really had to say about the Noahide laws. No one had really done a complete, comprehensive study of all of Torah literature throughout history and put it together in one place and said, this is what is the Noahide laws. No one had really done that. Everything happening until the year 2000 was really not, it wasn't really based on anything. It was a lot of thinking. Now, I will say the Lubavitcher Rebbe was an exception and Vendyl was an exception. The Lubavitcher Rebbe had his own work and his own research in the Noahide laws, and Vendyl had done his own. But there was not really a published compendia of what the Noahide laws were all about. It wasn't until the first decade of the 21st century that need was met. And it was done with the publication of a book called the Sefer Sheva Mitzvos HaShem in Hebrew. The story of how this was written is a lot of people in the Lubavitch movement who had heeded Rabbi Schneersohn's call got involved in doing outreach to the Noahides, and they were constantly running into problems because they were running into fringe groups that were teaching these very bizarre interpretations of what of Torah to non-Jews. So what they did is these Lubavitch groups formed an organization called Ask Noah, which many of you may be familiar with, Ask Noah International. And they recruited a lot of rabbis from within the mainstream of Lubavitch to do research on the Noahide laws. Eventually, they realized that they needed to really contract an independent study. So what they did is they contacted a very important rabbi in Israel, Rabbi Moshe Weiner. I'm going to circle right here, who is a posek. When we're going to talk about this more, a posek is a decisor of Torah law. There's someone who is an authority on what is fact in the practice of the religion of the Torah. And they said, we want you to do an entire study of what the Noahide laws actually are in all of Torah literature, and we want it to be written down. So Rabbi Weiner spent 5 years full-time doing nothing but going through the books and compiled this 3-volume set called the Sefer Sheva Mitzvos HaShem. It's 3 large Hebrew volumes that go through the entirety of what the Noahide laws actually contain and what they actually say. This was the first comprehensive study and presentation of all of the fundamental principles of what it is to be a Noahide. All right? This was translated eventually as a book called The Divine Code. Now, the Divine Code, I'm going to tell you guys right now, the original Sefer Sheva Mitzvos HaShem is wonderful. I think every rabbi in the country should have a copy of it on their shelf. It was in Hebrew, unfortunately, which means that for the Noahide community, that's not terribly useful. The Divine Code is an excellent study of the Noahide laws. It is very difficult to use from a practical standpoint. If you have a question you want to look up, it's a very difficult book to use. A lot of the information in it is not practical or relevant today. Nevertheless, it's something that every single Noahide should have. If you don't own the Divine Code, I'd suggest that you contact Ray and talk to him. I think that Ray has copies of it available, but it's called The Divine Code by Rabbi Moshe Weiner. It is a fundamental book that every single Noahide should have. And if you ever need to know what is fact and what is not fact in the Noahide laws, this is the book really to go to. He did a phenomenal job, and it's a historical work. Since it was published, there's been a number of other books and studies of the Noahide laws written. The Divine Code and the Sefer Mitzvos HaShem sparked off this tremendous interest, and this is only in the past 5 to 6 years, in the mainstream world of Orthodox Jewish scholarship in the Noahide laws. And now you have a number of important books being produced. Most recently is the Toldos Noach by Rabbi Eliezer Baruch. Now the Toldos Noach is very important also for this course. I've been translating sections of the Toldos Noach and sending it out to people taking the course. I'm going to be sending it to you guys as well, because there's a lot of things in there that are very important. And we're going to talk about what those are in a future lesson. Okay? Today, if you kind of pull back and you take a look at the sum total of the Noahide movement today, where it's holding is you really have essentially two approaches to Noahism, and they're both extremely polarized. They're both very polarized, and I don't think that either of these approaches is entirely neutral and independent of other considerations, meaning political and other considerations. Approach number one is Noahism as Judaizing. The term Judaize means to imitate Jewish practice. Okay? Many of the fringe groups outside the Jewish mainstream have been advocating Judaizing. They've been telling Noahides, you should do everything that Jews do. You should wear a yarmulke, you should wear tzitzis, you should keep kosher. Now, the truth is that this is very problematic, and I'll tell you why. There are a number of principles within Torah law for Noahides that actually restrict Judaizing, the imitation of Jewish practices by non-Jews. Now, I'm not saying that Noahides cannot do certain mitzvos. What I'm saying is there are certain ones that cannot be done. And this is very clear, and this has been on the books for thousands of years since the giving of the Torah. Rather than help Noahides develop a positive, uniquely Noahide identity, many of these fringe groups are simply encouraging Noahides to imitate Jews. This has an inherent existential contradiction to it, and that contradiction is that if Noahism is supposed to be a universal relevance, it's supposed to be a way in which the Torah is universally relevant for all mankind, then we can't restrict the definition of that relevance to only a small group of people. Meaning that, I'll give you a good example. Let's talk about the festivals. I mentioned this in the lesson. The Jewish festivals are uniquely bound up with the Jewish experience and Jewish history. Yom Kippur is tied in with the sin of the golden calf. The holiday of Sukkot is tied in with the journeying in the wilderness and the divine clouds that accompanied the Jews. Most of our observances of these holidays are unique to the Jewish experience, not to the non-Jewish experience. The Mishnah, which is part of the Talmud, we're going to talk about it more in the future, however, tells us what the universal relevances of these holidays are. For example, the Mishnah tells us that the universal relevance of Passover is that it's the holiday upon which the world is judged on grain. Sukkot is the holiday upon which God judges the world for its water, for everyone in the world. So the universal relevance of the holiday of Sukkot is the abundance of water. For Noahides, that's the relevance of Sukkot. For Jews, we build the sukkah, the booth, because it reminds us of our journeying in the desert, which is unique to the Jewish experience. For Noahides, its relevance is it's the holiday upon which the world is judged on water. That's the universal experience. So even the Mishnah in the Torah acknowledges that there's a universal aspect and a Jewish aspect which is unique to our history. So if the Noahide laws are meant to be universal in their scope, then it doesn't make sense to define their observance and expression by the experience of the Jews, who are this very tiny subset of the entirety of humanity. So the Judaizing approach, besides the fact that it creates problems within established areas of Torah law, serious problems, and the fact that it's an existential contradiction. You're saying that the Noahide law is universal, but you can only engage in experience with them by imitating Jews. That's an inherent contradiction in what the Noahide laws are. That's a major problem. The second approach is problematic for different reasons. The second approach seems to be a knee-jerk reaction to the first approach. The second approach is to define boundaries and to draw lines. And we see this a lot. Many in the mainstream of the Jewish world, as a reaction to the Judaizing approach, have taken an ultra-conservative stance and have sought to define Noahism by what it can't be and what it can't do. Okay? It seeks to focus on saying that this is everything Noahides can't do. It's really there to restrict and to keep Noahism very separate from the Jewish world. The problem with this approach is that it overlooks a natural need that exists in the Noahide world. When I say it, I think a lot of you guys are going to hear it. Today in the Noahide world, there is a positive thirst there's a thirst and a craving for positive expressions of faith. Noahides today are proud of what they are, they're proud of what they believe, they're proud of what they know they can be, and they're proud of their connection to the Torah, and they want ways to express it. There's a craving, an intense desire for ways of affirming and expressing faith. Now, the Judaizing approach is problematic in that it seeks to give Noahides that expression by beseeching them to imitate the external Jewish symbols of connection to the Torah. The second approach is problematic because it simply tells Noahides what they can't do. There needs to be an approach that really works more on defining what these boundaries actually are based on the basis of Torah literature and defining what can be done versus what should not be done and what is being done wrong. In this course, I'm taking a slightly unique approach in this course, based upon having identified the situation in the Noahide world today. Our goal in this course is we need to clarify and define what a Noahide identity actually is. That's the first thing we have to clarify. What does it mean to be a Noahide? We then have to look at what the fundamental principles of Noahism are, where the laws come from, and what they entail. We then have to look within that to find what are the universal themes of the Torah and holidays. And most importantly, how may Noahides give legitimate, positive Noahide expression to these themes in a way that is consonant with traditional Torah thought and with traditional understanding of the Noahide laws. Okay? Unfortunately, like I said, the route being taken by many today, which is just to imitate Jewish practice, does nothing to acknowledge the unique aspect of the Noahide laws, and there are many unique aspects. The last thing is we need to define which areas of Noahism need more growth in the Noahide community and how to create positive expressions of Noahide faith through this growth. For example, Noahide prayer services. Music for Noahide worship is very important. Developing expressions of connection with the festivals of the Torah in a positive way is also very important. Now, the last time we did this course, when I brought up connection to the Jewish festivals, we had people that left the course very quickly. We had some people who left because they were upset that I was saying that Noahides have connection to the Jewish festivals. And there were other people that left because they said they heard me saying that Noahides may not have a connection with the Torah festivals. Please, nobody leave yet. Stick it out. See where we're going with this. What we're looking at here, we want to see what do the books actually say? What do the original sources have to say about the Noahide connection to the festivals? What is that connection? And then how can it be expressed positively? Now, I will tell you that many times the actual connection is not what we may think it is. We're going to have lots of surprises. So stay tuned and hang in there. And we're going to see that there's a lot more to this than what meets the eye. So that's our overview of Noahide history until the present day. And that sort of locates what we're going to be doing and how it fits in with this. Let's stop now. Let's take 5 minutes for questions, okay? And let's take 5 minutes for questions, all right? Please feel free to post. Lonnie Hale has a very, very good question. Were the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt considered Noahides, or were they converts? They were idolaters who were insincere converts. They were not clearly Noahides, nor were they clearly converts. They were basically Egyptian idolaters who converted under false pretenses to get out of Egypt. That's basically what you're dealing with. So it's very hard to call them Noahides within the sense that we're discussing it, and it's also very hard to call them true converts. All right, more questions, guys. Come on. I love interaction. Like I said, I feel very weird doing these because I feel like I'm talking to myself, and the more input I get from you guys, the better. Anything else? Okay. If not, guys, then let's go ahead. Let's do this. Lesson 3 and 4 are going to be going out to everybody before the end of this week. Ray, I'm going to send them over to you very shortly. And lesson 3 and 4 are going to be dealing with some fundamental stuff. We're basically dealing with fundamental things for the first 10 lessons or so. When you get in lesson 3 and 4, go ahead and give them a read through. Give this one a read through. Send me any questions that you guys might have. I'll be happy to respond via email. And if you need to talk to me in person, as always, please contact Noahide Nations. My email address again is acb@noahidenations.com. And please feel free to email me with any of your questions. All right, guys. Thanks. Everybody, take care. Have a great weekend. And we will be in touch shortly. Gilbert, email Noahide Nations. Email Ray for that, and they'll get a copy of it to you guys. Oh, you guys did not get this one yet. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, I'll send out lesson 2, 3, and 4. Ray, let me do me a favor. Ray, I'm going to send you 2, 3, and 4. Let's go ahead and get those all sent out to the group. Okay, guy? Will that work? Perfect. Everybody, have a great week. Thank you so much. And take care. We'll be in touch shortly. Bye-bye.